Napoleon called him shit in a silk stocking. It was meant as an insult. Talleyrand probably took it as a compliment. Charles-Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord served under the Ancien Régime, the Revolution, Napoleon, the Bourbon Restoration, and the July Monarchy. He survived the guillotine, exile, disgrace, and the collapse of every government he ever served. He outlasted them all, not despite his flexibility, but because of it. He wasn't a military genius. He wasn't a visionary idealist. He was something rarer and, in the long run, more durable. The greatest diplomatic mind in modern European history. Born into one of France's oldest aristocratic families in 1754, Talleyrand was pushed into the clergy despite having no vocation for it. A club foot had disqualified him from military service, and the church was what remained for a second son of noble blood. He became Bishop of Autun at 34, not through faith, but through politics. Even then, the pattern was clear. He would use whatever institution surrounded him, extract what value it offered, and leave before it collapsed on him. When the revolution came, he didn't flee to exile like most of the nobility. He sided with reform, helped draft the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and proposed nationalizing church property, effectively betraying the institution that had made him. The Pope excommunicated him. Talleyrand was unmoved. He had already moved on. The deeper insight: most people define themselves by the system they belong to. When the system falls, they fall with it. Talleyrand's genius was that he never fully identified with any system. He served them all and survived them all. As foreign minister under Napoleon, Talleyrand was at the height of his powers. He negotiated the Treaty of Luneville, managed a complex web of European coalitions, and helped reshape the continent's borders with a combination of patience, charm, and surgical precision. But he saw further than Napoleon. While Napoleon was still winning battles, Talleyrand was already calculating what would happen after the victories ended. He understood something his master refused to accept. Military dominance creates resentment, and resentment, accumulated across enough nations and enough years, eventually produces a coalition that no genius on the battlefield can defeat. He began, quietly and at considerable personal risk, to work against Napoleon's more aggressive expansionism, feeding information to the Tsar, counseling restraint in letters, positioning himself for the world that would come after. Napoleon eventually discovered enough to dismiss him in fury. Talleyrand retired to his estate, waited, and watched the empire he'd helped build collapse exactly as he'd predicted. The deeper insight: there's a difference between tactical intelligence, winning the fight in front of you, and strategic intelligence, understanding which fights are worth having in the first place. Napoleon was perhaps the greatest tactical mind in history. Talleyrand played a different game entirely. If Talleyrand had a single finest hour, it was Vienna in 1814 to 1815. France arrived at the peace conference as the defeated aggressor. Every major power, Britain, Austria, Russia, Prussia, had reason to punish her, partition her, humiliate her. Talleyrand arrived representing a country with almost no leverage and no allies. Within weeks, he had made France indispensable. His method was elegant. He introduced the principle of legitimacy, the idea that the Congress should restore the rightful, legitimate rulers of Europe, not simply reward the victors. It sounded like high principle. It was also, not coincidentally, the argument that most benefited France. By framing the conversation around a moral principle rather than raw power, he shifted the terms of the entire negotiation. He then drove a wedge between the Allied powers. Britain and Austria were nervous about Russian and Prussian ambitions in Poland and Saxony, and positioned France as the reasonable, stabilizing voice. Within months, France had signed a secret defensive alliance with Britain and Austria against Russia and Prussia. The defeated power had become a central player. France left Vienna with its borders largely intact, its dignity restored, and its place in the European order preserved. It was, by any measure, the greatest diplomatic reversal in modern history, achieved not through military force or inherited advantage, but through pure strategic intelligence and the careful manipulation of principles, perceptions, and rivalries. It's tempting to read Talleyrand as simply an opportunist, a man without values, loyal only to himself, willing to betray anyone for the right price. His enemies certainly read him that way, and he gave them plenty of material to work with. But that reading misses something important. Talleyrand had one genuine, consistent principle beneath all the flexibility: the belief that stability was the supreme political good, and that the worst outcome, worse than defeat, worse than humiliation, worse than personal disgrace, was chaos. The revolution had shown him what chaos looked like. The terror had killed people he knew. He spent the rest of his life through every regime change and political earthquake, working to prevent a return to that condition. His betrayals weren't random. They were almost always directed against whoever, in his judgment, was about to destabilize the system beyond recovery, whether that was the Church in 1789, Napoleon in 1808, or the ultra-royalists in the 1820s. He switched sides not out of pure self-interest, but out of a cold, consistent calculation about where stability lay. The deeper insight: pragmatism without principle is just opportunism. Pragmatism anchored to one deep, genuine value, in Talleyrand's case, stability over ideology, is something closer to wisdom. The art is knowing the difference. Napoleon believed in force, speed, and decisive action, the concentrated application of overwhelming power at the right moment. It was a philosophy that won him 30 years of spectacular victories and ultimately cost him everything. Talleyrand believed in time, patience, and the management of perception. He understood that in the long run, no amount of military genius can substitute for a durable framework of relationships, interests, and mutual restraint. He understood that the most powerful negotiating tool isn't a threat. It's making yourself indispensable to whoever holds the power. He also understood something almost no one around him wanted to acknowledge: that every empire, every regime, every seemingly permanent order is temporary. The wise man's job isn't to bet everything on the current system. It's to ensure that when the system changes, as it inevitably will, he's still in the room. Napoleon died in exile on a remote island, dictating his memoirs to a dwindling audience. Talleyrand died in Paris, aged 84, having received the last rites of the church that had excommunicated him 60 years earlier, surrounded by the most powerful figures of the age. He had outlasted everything. Talleyrand's life is a lesson in a particular kind of intelligence that history rarely celebrates because it's too cold, too patient, too stripped of the romantic drama we prefer in our great men. It's the intelligence of the long game. Identify the one principle you won't compromise. Be flexible about everything else. Never fully identify with the institution you're serving. Watch for where the system is going, not just where it is. And when everyone around you is intoxicated by their own power, start quietly preparing for what comes next. Napoleon moved faster, Talleyrand moved smarter. In the end, smarter won.